Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, is David Griscom. David, hello.
How's it going, brother?
It's going well. And joining us today is Veena Dubal. Veena is a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings, focusing on technology, society, work law, precarity, and race. Veena, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. One of the early shows I think we did on Left Reckoning was on the Harvard Clean Slate Initiative, which is sort of and that was tipped to us by Marshall Steinbaum. And this is sort of in line with that. So you have a new article or about a month-old article in the Regulatory Review here that I wanted to share with folks called "The False Promise of Third Category Worker Laws." Proposition 22 and similar laws exacerbate workforce inequalities. Before we get to the modern sort of racial wage code situation, give us a little bit of an overview of the history. So a lot of us will be familiar with the New Deal's limitations, for instance. Give us just an overview of what led up to this moment.
Sure. So the first minimum wage regulations that we had on a federal level, as your listeners likely know, were promulgated by the Congress in 1938 under the Fair Labor Standards Act. But prior to that, before the Fair Labor Standards Act, there was the new Recovery Administration, the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration, which was an administrative agency that was supposed to set minimum wages in different sectors and different industries. And what happened was essentially that industrialists argued and former plantation owners argued for Black workers that were much lower. And they said things like Black workers are lazy, they are less efficient, even Black families need less money than white families. And then they threatened disemployment. They said, look, wages at the same rate as for industries, when you set them for white workers, then we're just going to not hire Black workers and only hire white workers. And this was, of course, in the midst of the Great Depression, and it generated this really big debate that you might not expect within the Black civil rights community. And there were the elites who said, absolutely, we should accept this because otherwise Black workers are going to lose their jobs, and this thing essentially. And you had other sort of civil rights elites who, like the folks who were then working with the National Urban League and the NAACP, who said, no, we have to fight for employment, anti-discrimination laws in work. We have to fight for this idea that everyone should be earning the same amount regardless of race. And they made a really important argument that I think continues to be relevant today, which is that if there's a different lower wage for Black workers and white workers, then it's going to be really hard, or different minimum wage for Black workers and white workers, then it's going to be really hard to have a unified labor movement. But they lost that battle. They lost that battle at the National Recovery Administration, and in facially neutral ways, they lost it at when the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. So what's interesting is that historians write about how all these debates where race was articulated in very obvious ways at the National Recovery Administration level, and then with the Fair Labor Standards Act, you don't have those same debates in the legislative history. There was very clear sectoral carve-outs for Black workers, and specifically for Black women workers in doing domestic work, and for Black workers doing agricultural work. And those carve-outs remained for decades and really contributed to what we now call generational wealth inequalities.
And so Prop 22, how does that sort of, and I guess when we're talking about how Prop 22 continues that, legacy. The way that they sort of, yeah, exactly. And then this sort of stuff is becoming known because of, just realization of how those programs were instituted. they're trying to speak to that problem at the same time as solidifying it.
The problem, exactly. That's really well put. So the piece in the Regulatory Review is actually based on an article that was just published in the Harvard Harvard Law and Policy Review. Sorry. And what in that longer piece that you guys might be interested in reading, what I talk about is that I do ethnographic work with Uber drivers, like engaged ethnographic work. I'm involved in the organizing as well, and I kept hearing drivers during the Prop 22 debates and leading up to Prop 22 say things like, "This is just like what happened with the domestic workers, with the farm workers." There was one guy in particular whose parents had been farm workers, and he said, like, this is the same. Like, they want us to have laws that are different because we're a racial minority workforce, and that's the only reason that they can get away with it. And sure enough, when I started to sort of look into the history, I was struck by how, wow, like, this is essentially what Prop 22 was, is essentially a new way to regulate the minimum wage for a particular sector of workers. And that particular sector of workers is predominantly racial minority and immigrant workers. Like, even Lyft will say on a national level, 70% racial minority and immigrant, according to their own statistics. And then in urban areas, like in San Francisco, for example, the numbers are, as high as 80%. And so for this particular racial minority workforce, you have this new law that says that there's not a minimum wage by time anymore. The minimum wage is now based on this brand new regulatory category called engaged time. And so you're only paid, you're paid in piece, essentially. You're paid like by the piece. You're only paid after the algorithms have allocated work. And so that's a completely unpredictable amount of time for workers. And for two reasons. It's unpredictable because the system is not based on supply and demand, on matching supply and demand efficiently, right? Like, you don't just get the driver that's closest to you. What goes into that calculation is all kinds of things, including whether or not that driver is about to meet a bonus, or if they're about to meet the amount of engaged time they need to trigger all these benefits that cost the company a lot of money. So if possible, what drivers will say, like, especially in since Prop 22 passed, like, they'll just stop getting work as they hit the number of 30 hours of engaged time they need to get some of these benefits that the company is supposed to provide after Prop 22. So it's like algorithmically allocated. It makes it unpredictable. And then it's also unpredictable because demand is completely unpredictable, as we've seen, especially since the pandemic, when like days when drivers think that they should be really busy, they're not really busy. People are, remain nervous about taking Ubers or Lyfts in unpredictable times because all of a sudden numbers go up, and so people are not willing to get in a car with someone else. And so, for all of those reasons, the passage of Prop 22 really signifies, and we've seen it replicated, and we should talk about this. We've now seen a version of Prop 22 replicated in Washington State with a sweetheart deal between Teamsters and Uber. And what it really signifies is a new kind of racial wage code, reminiscent of what was passed with the Fair Labor Standards Act, and reminiscent of what we saw companies, industrialists arguing during the National Recovery Administration. And as you said, the irony at this point, the perverse irony, is that they're not using the companies to get these laws passed are not using the same sort of clearly racist language. Like, they're not saying, oh, Black workers, a racial minority workforce is inefficient, or, oh, racial minority workforces need less money to survive. What they're saying is that essentially that this is the only work that those folks can get, and they need it. And if you force them to pay a minimum wage, then they're going to take it away. And and so that has prompted a lot of confusion, especially when they're virtue signaling their sort of, the companies are virtue signaling their anti-racist bona fides during the Prop 22 debate. And I write about this at length in the new racial wage code paper. They did all of these sort of really kind of upsetting things, particularly upsetting to the drivers, where they would, Dara Khosrowshahi came out and said that that Uber was an anti-racist company, and he wrote a big blog post about how Uber was an anti-racist company. They put up a huge billboard in downtown Oakland, home to the Black Power movement, that said, if you like support racism, delete Uber. Which really like made no sense, but was trying to say that like Uber was somehow synonymous with being an anti-racist. And so, yeah, like I think, I've argued that they tricked people into voting for Prop 22 by not just obscuring what the proposition actually did, right? They kept saying, I heard Anthony Fox, who was, former Department of Transportation cabinet member under Obama, moved on to Lyft as their public policy head. I heard him say on National Public Radio that Prop 22 was going to give workers 120% of the minimum wage. And that was just not true. I mean, it was complete BS. It was giving workers 120% of the minimum wage of engaged time, which according to their own studies is something like 60% of the time that workers are laboring. And so, and that too, unpredictable, completely unpredictable. So it wasn't really guaranteeing anything. But that's what they kept saying. And they had, where are you guys located?
I'm in Brooklyn, David's in Austin.
Austin. Okay. So, and they kept saying, during the, for those of your viewers who are in California, they'll recall, we were bombarded with advertisements with like pictures of images of single Black mothers, Latino fathers who had 3 other jobs, and their attestations to this idea that Prop 22 was going to be great and do great things for them, and they needed it to pass. And so it is particularly gross that they use the language of anti-racism to get a law passed that actually takes away rights from racial minority workers and creates a third category for them, a third category that is far lower than what every other employee in the United States gets. And and again, what's troubling is that now this is gaining traction. So even though Prop 22 was widely viewed as a huge disaster for the workforce, the Teamsters in Washington, after years and years and years of kind of having a conflict-oriented relationship with Uber, assented to a sweetheart deal. And one of the drivers involved in that fight said, "Look, we agreed to this with a gun to our heads." The company said, if we do not agree to this, they're going to bring on a proposition just like they brought on Proposition 22 in Washington State. And at least with this, with what they agreed to in Washington State, it looks just like Prop 22 basically, but they give money to the union to have, they call as an association, but it's not clear if that association can do anything meaningful. It just sort of gives them money.
Yeah, it's not a good sign when you have the Teamsters, and I just got into an argument with a spokesperson from the Americans for Tax Reform, which is Grover Norquist's outlet, and he's doing some Prop 22 stuff. And he sent me a bunch of testimonials from freelancers, and it's like, the day that I grant the idea that Grover Norquist cares about freelancers, I do not buy that concern. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, they did such a good job of mobilizing freelancers in California during the Prop 22 campaign, like on social media. Actually, ironically, and this just blows my mind, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the committee in California, is currently investigating whether employment rights hurt minority workers. And they have, if you go to any of the meetings, the right has done such a good job of mobilizing these freelancers. I mean, they're the same cast of characters over and over again. A lot of white women who write, for blogs or whatever, magazines, but almost all ideologically right wingers who I think really stand against this idea of government intervention in business and in people's lives, and it's it's their voice was disproportionately loud during the Prop 22 debates, and frankly, even before Prop 22 passed, after AB 5 passed, companies that, like franchisors, all of the sorts of entities that benefit from misclassification of workers and subcontracting were so worried after AB 5 was passed in California, which was trying to get at all of the subcontracting and outsourcing and fake freelancing and misclassification. And their PR people, their political opposition firms, man, they did a good job.
Yeah, this might be a little bit remedial, but for folks, why do bosses benefit from this misclassification?
Sure. I mean, in the US, with the decline of the welfare state, all security is dependent on employment. And for better or for worse, and I would argue for worse, we have linked and we continue to link everything to work. And so in order to, as you know, have health insurance, have Social Security, have access to any kind of basic living standard, you have to be working. Any kind of security, you have to be working. I mean, notice even the pandemic relief flowed through work. I mean, you had either filed W-2s or 1099s to get any kind of unemployment assistance during the pandemic. And so, and that might have made sense for particular reasons, but we don't have any kind of security that is just separate from employment. And so it costs 1/3 more to have workers. So at a basic level, it's super expensive to have a workforce. Your overhead goes up by a lot, but that's only one part of the story. In addition to your actual overhead going up, when you have to pay someone a minimum wage and provide workers' compensation, insurance, etc., unemployment insurance, taxes. The other thing is that, aside from that, is that you, as the primary entity, the employer, hold all of the risk, which is how it should be, because you are the one that has capital. You're the one that has deep pockets, or ostensibly has deep pockets. And so if there is an accident and your worker, caused the accident or was negligent in causing the accident, then you, as the employer, are liable. You carry the insurance, you are liable. If you pretend like everyone is a small business owner, then that liability goes away. And I think that's one of the biggest sort of under-discussed parts, particularly of ride-hail and food delivery misclassification, because you have these workers who are doing what is one of the most dangerous jobs, according to OSHA, in the country, regularly, engaging or having accidents, being held up. You hear a lot about sexual assault and sexual harassment, all of this stuff that, the primary entity, Uber or Lyft or Instacart, should be liable for, but they sort of shirk that liability by pretending that the workers are not their workers. And that's another reason. The third reason I would say that, this is especially true for a company like Google that has more temporary contracted workers than they have full-time employees. For them, when they move on to another project or they want to downsize their workforce, they don't have to report that they just laid off thousands of people. because those people are not employed by them. They're employed by the staffing agency that they have a contract with. And not having to report that has all kinds of impacts, including impacts on their, their stock. They don't have to be like, well, we just laid off 1,500 people. And so it has sort of these sort of PR benefits as well to not have a full-time employed workforce, and to pretend that everyone is working at arm's length, either as a contractor or through a staffing agency. So when I do these exercises with my students, when I'm teaching employment law, I'll teach them, they know where I'm coming from. I gave them all of the background, and then I have them do an exercise where they're setting up a company, and they pretend to be general counsel, and they break up into different groups. And this is after we've discussed all of the ramifications of misclassification, and they're supposed to advise their client, the company, how to set up their workforce. Do they set up as independent contractors? Go through a staffing agency? Do they are they full-time employees? And every year, almost invariably, everyone but one or two groups will set up as independent contractors, because they're trained to say, well, this is my client is the company, and this is actually what makes financial sense for the company. Makes a lot of sense in terms of risk allocation, et cetera. And so, on the one hand, all of my advocacy and the worker advocacy that I've been engaged in alongside workers for the past many years has been around misclassification. And on the other hand, we really have to disincentivize on some level this kind of these high incentives for firms to misclassify.
And just to add to that, one of the things to note about the ride hailing companies, just compared to how you would run maybe a taxi company or something like that, is if you're having those employees have to put up their own kind of physical assets, like their car, they're putting miles on it, it's a huge cut to your bottom line, because you don't have to pay for maintenance. You don't have to pay for the depreciation, the value of the car. And again, it's all these things, the responsibility then just falls on the backs of the workers.
What's interesting about this point that you've made that's so important is that it has played a huge role in not just in the misclassification and the precarity of the workforce, but also in the debates over wages. So there are these ongoing debates about how much does a driver really make? And, in some ways, what I like to point out is that is the point. The fact that some really smart economists can't figure out how much drivers are really making means that this is a messed up system. The point is that everyone can agree that there are workers making below the minimum wage, and if everyone can agree that, that's really where the debate needs to stop. But there have been these sort of ugly debates between economists that are paid by Uber and independent economists. Louis Hyman headed a study at Cornell that was I think that they were paid by Uber to do the study. They got all their data from Uber, and then Michael Reich at Berkeley and James Parrott at the New School did another study, and this is actually during the Prop 22 debate. So it was very influential. They did an independent study in which their data was very similar. It wasn't that they had different types of data. It was how they calculated depreciation, how they calculated how much gas cost, and the Uber sponsored people want to say, well, we're not going to count the car depreciation because especially not in that fake time period, that non-engaged time period, because they're not working then. Or we don't want to calculate car depreciation at all because they are or the car cost at all because they would have bought the car anyway, which of course is not true. Versus, the economists who I tend to agree with are like, no, you have to calculate car depreciation because they're driving around during that time period, whether or not they're getting paid. And that is time that is benefiting the company. And two, a lot of these people were duped into buying cars. There were all these earnings guarantees that the FTC has been examining to say, are these actually possible? Are these real earnings guarantees? Or are these sort of imaginary ideals that maybe the worker could make if they really worked their butt off? early on, there was also a lot of, there was alleged fraud into the companies facilitating leases and facilitating purchases at prices that were above market rate. Again, really speaking to the just how odious this business model is. It has historically been about squeezing people who have nothing, and then and if you do it at a large enough scale, maybe turning a profit over time. But the larger point is that after all of these years, they've hemorrhaged so much money, and whatever profits they've been able to make, and I think Lyft has maybe recently had 1 quarter of profitability. It doesn't seem sustainable.
And you can only
they said that in their SEC filings. They said if we have to provide a minimum wage, then that's going to impact whether or not we have a successful company.
I'm just saying, like, if you've seen any of the developments, as of course you have, like in what's been happening in the ride hailing for industry for workers, imagine what's going to start happening when there's that kind of financial squeeze, when interest rates continue to go up, like the inflows of financial capital that was sort of upholding companies like Lyft and Uber for so long. Those start to get a little bit tighter. I mean, I don't think that you can sort of separate, the kind of anxiety that I think a lot of people, particularly in the tech industry, have about the next couple of years without having the access to the fire hose of capital that they've enjoyed for the past 10 years, and think that it's going to be good for the people who actually provide the services that people pay for.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see a number of things, not just the money running out, which is, they've already started to dip into debt, just try and finance some of the stuff, but also like all of these externalities, like gas prices in the Bay Area are $6.20. And if you're working to pay off a car loan, then you can't just stop working because you've become dependent on that. And what it generates is, for the most precarious workers, a system of indentured servitude where you're literally working in order to keep working, in order to pay off debt. And I think, what I hope, and I can't say this for certain, but I think that over time, the regulatory environment is really going to shift. I mean, that's what we've seen historically, right? Like in the taxi industry, you had a very similar setup where people were driving around in their cars, fares were unregulated, there was price gouging. Just, today we have price gouging through algorithms, but there's a lot of price gouging. There's a lot of lack of safety. Then in the midst of the Great Depression, because of like all of the horrible things that were happening in the industry, including that people couldn't make a living wage, you saw, and in response to widespread organizing and strikes and direct actions, you had local regulations put in place where you're like, okay, well, we actually need to regulate prices, and we actually need to regulate wages in this industry. And then the union negotiated a contract. So you saw what made sense, which is the gradual governance of this sector. And I should say that the evidence suggests that the sector was never profitable without these sorts of constraints placed in, without the supply and demand, or the supply constrained and fares constrained. And then I feel like we have this kind of same situation. So eventually we're going to see some version of governance that's going to, as we've seen in New York City, for example, that's limited the number of vehicles or drivers that can be on the road at any given time. And I think it's going to make it very difficult for these companies to ever turn a profit, at least on the work of ride hail. I actually think that the diamond for these companies is increasingly not going to be the ride hailing. It's going to be the data collection and what they do with the data collection and the data models that they build and what they're able to sell. So as we get, as we sort of realize all of the problems of the industry, everything from really needing to provide workers' compensation for these workers, really needing to provide stable wages, needing to provide good prices for for consumers, et cetera, and maybe start to see some re-regulation in the coming decades. I worry that what is going unseen by regulators and by consumers, and certainly by drivers, is the extraordinary amount of information they are collecting on all of us all the time that use the services, either as drivers or as work or as consumers, and what they could potentially do with that data. And certainly they have more information on workers than they do on you and I. But like, for example, I noticed Lyft did something. I don't use these services, but I was looking for a bar or something in downtown San Francisco, and I was Googling, and what came up was something that resembled Yelp, but it was offered by Lyft. And what they were able to do was to say, like, a lot of people have been going to this bar. It fits sort of what you're looking for. Why don't you go ahead and schedule a ride? And so you can imagine how ultimately they would then say to that bar, you know, give us a percentage and we'll send more people to the bar. You can imagine how they would sell all of this data mobility information to cities, or at least for cities to see it as being really valuable. I mean, they could do so much with it. And so I worry that that's kind of ultimately where they see their money making business in the future.
Right. And one thing they won't be doing is monetizing in a way that goes back to the drivers.
Oh, no. And that's the other thing, is that non-engaged time period that I keep talking about, where they're like, no, we don't want to pay workers for this time period. Workers are still collecting data for them during that time period. And so it ultimately does benefit the company, even if they are doing something else, or even, you know, like this idea that they shouldn't be paid for that time period because they're not working really just sort of ignores the basic reality of what's going on, which is that the people are driving around and around and around and around looking for work, hoping to get a ping. And they're also in the process collecting traffic data, et cetera, which benefits the companies, and that the workers themselves don't have access to. And even if they did, what would they do with it? Yeah. And it sort of reminds me that, like, another aspect of this work that's so awful, or the companies that are so awful, is the billions of dollars that they are taking away from public transportation, which is what, again, like it goes back to the irony of what we were talking about at the very beginning, where they were like, oh, this is so good for racial minority workers. And essentially they're you know, trying to distract from how they are recreating and relying on racial inequality. But similarly, you all will recall, like, in 2013, how they were like, this is the answer to climate change. Like, no one's going to use their own cars anymore. Everyone's going to go in an Uber or a Lyft, and this is so great for the environment, which, like, didn't make sense, you know, if you stopped and thought about it for 2 minutes. But I heard over and over and over again in regulatory meetings, I heard lobbyists and company representatives say over and over and over again that this was somehow climate friendly. To have people driving, and then we had to like generate data to show that this wasn't climate friendly. This was actually like destroying infrastructure and really bad for the environment. But further, they are completely taking millions of dollars away from public transportation. And so they like argue that, like, oh, you know, low income workers rely on us to get to work or to get to the hospital or to get to the grocery store. Like, this is so important. On the other hand, they're price gouging those low income workers and consumers, and taking billions of dollars away from public transportation, where we have like a democratic say in how we move, and mobility more generally, and reliable low fares for the most part for public people who use public transportation. It's just it's like the worst of the worst.
And it's like, and just piggybacking off of this, like, it's a tier system too, right? Because it's like, I don't know, I'm in Austin, it's a car city. You know, we have some public transportation, we're trying to build more, but think about it, like, it's a pain in the ass, especially if you don't want to drive, if you're going out on the weekend or something like that. You know, if you're wealthy enough, you can afford to do the Uber, Lyft, but for the vast majority of other people, they're on underfunded, failing public transportation. So it's just like, it's one of those things that sort of presents itself as a solution, but it's a solution for a certain group of people. That also hurts a lot of people in the meantime.
Absolutely right. So around the time period that Uber started in in San Francisco, it was like the rise of the smart city. This whole idea that, the future of cities was data and information on mobility that was gathered through data. And this was, this is where everything was going. And San Francisco was one of these sort of experimental spaces, of course. And then Mayor Ed Lee, who was largely voted into office as a result of funding from Silicon Valley, Ron Conway in particular, he appointed this guy who was this guy from industry as a chief innovation officer. His name was Jay Knott, and he was like the city's first chief innovation officer. I think this was like one of the first, he was the first chief innovation officers anywhere. I mean, what does this even mean, chief innovation officer for a city? I'm still very confused about this. But one of the first things that he did, and this sort of blew my mind, was try to quote unquote fix the San Francisco taxi system. And I thought to myself, this is a problem that only upper middle class people in San Francisco have, because no one else takes taxis. The public transportation system is good. We all take buses. We all take the BART. We take the subway. This is a problem for rich people. And yet it was like the first thing that he saw as necessary to fix. He didn't want to have to wait for a taxi. And it was that sort of attitude, I think, that led to the facilitation of these companies of Uber and Lyft being legalized in the city, when they were completely operating illegally in almost every market that they entered. It was that attitude where the people who were in charge, the elites who were in charge, thought about their inconveniences of their own lives and thought about how, like, what an easy fix. To have a servant class of people that was cultivated over time, provide cheap rides for you, no matter that actually anyone with any sort of sense of civic respect or thinking about the long term would say, no, what you need is more robust public transportation for everyone, because while it's inconvenient for you to jump in your car and you don't want to jump in your car because maybe you want to have a glass of wine or two at dinner, like Tom over there in Bayview, Hunters Point, needs to get to his job, and he needs to get to his job using public transportation. Like, how can we make this better? It was like a mentality, as you said, that was driven by, we could call it a tiered system, or we could driven by elitism, by class.
Yeah, I want to move to how the workers are sort of organizing against this stuff. But first, a little bit more on the boss's tactic stuff, because in your new racial wage code paper, you have a few concepts. Corporate racial benevolence is one of them. Predatory inclusion. And I just think, like, to go back to what we're talking about with Uber posing as an anti-racist company, it really is despicable in a country that has as many racism problems that we do, that they dress up in that sort of garb. Yeah. And theoretically, I could see why that would be appealing to someone. Like, I would like to work for a new fancy company that is committed to these sorts of ideas. And then, like you say, are sort of, it's a predatory inclusion. Like, just define predatory inclusion for us.
Yeah, so I draw from sociologist Louise Seamster, who's amazing and writes on race and debt. And what I argue is that these sorts of innovators, these private industry innovators, often use the language of inclusion to expand their reach and to justify their existence. So in Uber's case, the whole idea early on and continues to be that anyone can work now. You don't have to. You could have a felony on your record and you could still work. Like, we are widening the job market for people who are otherwise excluded from the job market. And we're including them in the economy in this way, making it easier for them to work. But the term they're including those people in the market are predatory, right? They're selling these people who have nothing cars. They're telling them that they could potentially earn a certain amount of money if they work X, Y, and Z. And then they make that very, very, very hard. It makes it very hard for them to earn that amount of money. And what I find is the most precarious of people, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, are often, as I said, like working to pay off debt. They're working owed to car companies, to banks, etc. They can, even if they don't have enough money. I mean, this is like striking to me. If you don't have enough money in your account to pay for gas and you need to start working, you can get a small loan to get gas in your car so that you start working, in even more debt than you already are. And this is worse in outside of the North Atlantic and the global South, like in Brazil. In India, I think also Uber has this thing where they are ultimately just like a payday loan company. So your app, your employer is also the bank officer, the loan officer. They have all of your financial information, and you can see kind of how incredibly dystopian this is, where again, you're including people in the sort of formal economy and at the same time, literally controlling every aspect of their lives. Like you can even lower wages because you're like, oh, well, this person, I'm going to garnish $250 at the end of the week. And so, I might as well make them, if there's no minimum wage, make them earn as little as possible before they can pay me back. I mean, it's like, I couldn't have thought of anything more cruel or evil, but that's like essentially where they are. So that's essentially what I say is predatory inclusion, that like, oh, great, you're hiring ex-felons who might have a hard time getting work, but you're hiring on them on terms that are actually harmful to them, and making a lot of money off of them in the process. The other term that you referenced, what was it? What did I say? Oh, racial benevolence.
Racial benevolence, yeah.
Yeah, just like a story. I was talking to this woman who worked for a gig economy company, and met her at a party, and she said that she was like their chief people officer. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, oh, I just make sure that everyone is like there is equity across wages, across salaries, that people's experience, racial equity and gendered equity. And I was like, wait, for whom are you doing this? Like, this is a gig company. And she was like, oh, like the execs and the software engineers. And I was like, okay, so you're not doing this for the workers. And so this is bizarre idea that like, oh, we are investing in making sure that we have women on our board, that we have Black and brown people, engineers, that, people's salaries in the building are more or less resembling one another. So there's not such a gender wage gap, not such a racial wage gap. But we're going to ignore the fact that we are completely relying on a workforce of people outside of the building that generates the primary product, that is rides and data collection, who are mostly people of color, 80% people of color, some of whom go home in debt after working a 12-hour day. And that kind of cognitive dissonance cannot be actually real, right? Like they recognize that they are playing two games here. On the one hand, virtue signaling progressivism by offering diversity trainings to their customer service operators and bringing women on as software engineers. And on the other hand, dismantling the economic regulatory structure for racial equality at a national level. It's grotesque, and it also seems so clear, which is why I don't understand. Like I struggle every day with like, why do people buy into this? Like, why does Uber's anti-racism initiatives get any press? Why don't people just laugh? At the end of that particular article, I point out, I mean, this is just like completely nuts to me. And so again, grotesque. Lyft had a commercial in which they were talking about how they were donating rides. Again, like we have no idea. Donating rides, does that mean that the driver just doesn't get paid? Who knows, right? Like, what does that mean to donate rides? Donating rides to like underserved communities to help people get to work or whatever. And in this feel-good ad with all these Black and brown, smiling Black and brown workers, they have Maya Angelou's poem, one of her really famous poems that she wrote for Bill Clinton's inauguration, as an overlay. And it's all about like a new day and, you know, all this feel-good, progressive stuff. And they sort of stop where she talks about the violence of capitalism, and how like you know, corporations are destroying the environment and like squeezing Black and brown people for all that they're worth. And like the fact that they just like used a portion of this poem that, you know, actually is like this beautiful, moving piece of literature that points out and expounds on all of these problems that people feel, that they just extracted a portion of it and used it to market their product, that which does the exact opposite of what they say it does in some ways. It's just so gross. Yeah. It's so insincere, and I mean, it's naive of me, I understand, but I struggle every day with why people buy into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild. I mean, the thing is that compared to Howard Schultz getting out there and saying, you know, we got NFTs coming, guys, yeah. Right? And I think like why it's, I mean, that's what they need to say, because like you say in your new racial wage code paper, social movement organizing is really important. Like that there's an appetite for this, so they can kind of maybe simulate it a little bit with PR. So could you talk about social movement organizing and COVID organizing a little bit before we let you go?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll tell you, I'll focus, I've studied sort of social movement organizing across the tech sector, including in the Amazon warehouse context and like Amazon Mechanical Turk context. But let me just talk a little bit, since we've been focused today on Uber and Lyft. I'll tell you about the amazing and robust organizing that's been happening over the course of many years. So roughly 2016 was a huge year for these companies and for workers. There was like just a shift that occurred where I think they started lowering prices or lowering wages dramatically, and also started cracking down. Like some workers had figured out algorithmic ways to game the system, and they started cracking down on that, just pushing those people off of the app, just firing them essentially. A number of protests in California and LA and San Francisco. And ultimately those protests led to and again, this is like blows my mind. It's so amazing, to the creation of a long-standing organization, Rideshare Drivers United, almost entirely volunteer-based, is not getting funding from unions, unfortunately, although they should be, and we can talk about why they're not. Really dedicated core group of organizers who have been doing one-on-one organizing all up and down California. I would say that they were primarily responsible for the on-the-ground organizing that got AB 5 passed, which, you know, an appellate court ultimately found made them employees under California law. They organized really hard against Proposition 22, even in the context of COVID, where like some of the unhoused workers were who couldn't even sleep in the national parks, where some of them had been like camping out, or couldn't sleep in their cars anymore because the police were like, you know, like, you can't, this is COVID, it's lockdown, you can't be here. They were in very, very bad situations in shelters, etc. Continued to organize, and they like organize in these amazing ways. Like, for example, during COVID, at the beginning, you'll remember there were kind of two avenues to get unemployment insurance. There was PUA, Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, and then there was regular unemployment insurance. And they were owed regular unemployment insurance, and it mattered which one they filed for, because PUA all those expenses we were talking about. And so you would get like $200 less a week than you were actually owed. Plus, PUA was passed later. It took the states a really long time to get it together, and so you had like 2 months where no one was getting anything. And so they were they part of their anti-Prop 22 organizing was to say, hey, you're owed unemployment insurance, even though the companies emailed you and told you you're not. You actually are. And training people how to appeal their unemployment insurance denials, and then like sharing their money with each other. Like these people who have nothing, I saw people who have nothing share the little checks that they got to help support one another. It was like one of the most beautiful things. I've seen a lot of awful things between humans. This was like one of the most beautiful, moving things I've ever seen. Also, this happened in the context of interracial organizing that was influenced by the Black Lives Matters uprisings. A lot of really important conversations. It's not like, I'm not talking about workers who necessarily are all on the same page politically. And that movement, combined with COVID, combined with the fact that we're talking about a really diverse workforce, resulted in some real politicization that I, again, have never ever seen before. And there's a lot written about how the fact that employers rely on a racially diverse workforce often leads to or can be seen as an anti-union tactic, right? Like you bring in people from different parts of the world, and this makes it hard for them to organize together. But what I saw in this particular moment was actually the opposite, where you saw people shared understanding of why they were being I can't think of a better word, but being effed over in a particular way, why they were being ignored, why their lives literally didn't matter. Really interesting conversations between Latino workers and Black workers around ICE and local police, their experiences with police in that regard, and just like some solidarity that was remarkable. And so, the workers lost Prop 22. We lost, although, there's some percolation in the courts. A lower court has found it unconstitutional. The appellate court is now going to hear the matter in the coming months. But even though there was a loss, there was a lot of important political, social movement building happening. That, like, even what we saw in New York with the ALU, with the Amazon labor union, those folks who started the Congress on Essential Workers, a lot of that happened out here in the Bay. And started like Chris Smalls and Adrian Williams and all these amazing Amazon workers who had been organizing for some time, like got together, started the Congress on Essential Workers. They were also working against Prop 22. Like there was some fascinating tech sector solidarity happening. It was an important moment. And what I've learned in my life is that we don't win every battle the way that we want it to be won, but the production of a counter movement, the production of uprisings, of direct actions, of protests, that those are like beautiful wins and must be celebrated, because we get more than the eye can see, including really deep, important relationships that can lead to a structural change in the future.
That's very nicely said. Veena Dubal, she's professor of law at University of California, Hastings. You can find her at Veena Dubal on Twitter. Thank you so much, Veena, for joining us today.
Thanks.